they're gutted because they can't make it. But yeah, I'm very excited. I'm so intrigued to like know all of your process and how you got into it and everything. But yeah, how's it been stepping away from Cecily to work on the new book?
Oh, weird, and
Yeah,
in some ways very scary, because
yeah,
the Cecily and the King's Mother is, those stories have been in my head for 40 years.
yeah,
Been obsessed with it for 40 years.
yeah.
And the new book is new, and about a time that I haven't been obsessed with for 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels a bit of a mountain to climb.
Yeah.
It feels very different.
I suppose it's that kind of thing, isn't it? Where, like, not even just stepping afresh, but stepping afresh and having to research afresh as well.
Yeah.
Quite a change. Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you ever think of continuing on from Cecily later into the century, or?
Maybe. I'm really interested in the fate of the princes, the famous princes of the tower.
Yeah.
But I think there's so much new research being done about them right now, and so many more discoveries being made right now, that I want to kind of wait for all of that to come out.
Yeah, because I'm from the country, and so it's all like so tied into my city as well. So it's really interesting to see it all on paper, and not just in like the history classroom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's great. It's such exciting stuff, and I love it that history changes all the time. What we think we know now, we'll know different things in
definitely
10 years, 20, 50, 100 years time.
Yeah,
and we'll view all of this history so differently, and I think that's great. People have this idea that history is past and fixed and elastic, and it can't change.
No,
it changes constantly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it just goes, it speaks volumes that it's still being talked about, for sure. There's a reason why it is so discussed at length, and so many adaptations of different parts of, obviously with the War of the Roses, but especially like you go on into Tudors and into Stuarts, and there's a reason for that and why people love to talk about them, because as much as it feels removed from where we are now, it's still so, like, things that happen are still so relevant.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's funny how.
Have you been to see the musical Six?
I love Six musicals.
I went to see it the other night. I've seen it in London when it first came out, and I saw it again the other night. And it was brilliant because the audience was full of young girls.
Yeah.
Like young girls, 12, 13, 14, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
How brilliant. And it's still girl power, isn't it? It's I thought, all these young girls are here and they're getting hooked on history. They're getting hooked on.
It's so interesting as well, isn't it? Because I feel like, especially when it's said from the woman's perspective, like, we never learn anything about Anne of Cleves more than he didn't like the look of her and then they got divorced. Yeah. And so hearing that actually she pretended to be his cousin and then lived off in her own estate and had her own life, and the fact that they can kind of condense that as well into 7, 8 songs.
Yeah, they got so much right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And she and Henry became great friends, didn't they?
Besties.
So weird.
Yeah,
I had problems.
I feel like, it's isn't it funny though, because the original like dating app, Hans Holbein's the original Tinder.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I love that whole House of Holbein thing. So
I think it's just like I can't say that any people that you would go on dates with would be on your wedding day, but then you have Married at First Sight, so all links back up.
Yeah,
history repeats itself.
Yeah, you just look at a picture and choose.
Yeah. That's the one.
Yeah, I'll have her. Looks alright.
They show up and you're like, ooh, don't know about that one.
Have you watched Wolf Hall?
I've not. So I wanted to read the book for the longest time, and I just have never found the time to, because they're so chunky. But I told myself I can't watch the show until I've read the books.
Her interpretation of that whole Anne of Cleves thing is fascinating.
Yeah.
because she does it. So her interpretation is that Henry and Anne meet, and Anne doesn't realise at first who he is.
Mm-hmm.
And then when she realises he's Henry, she can't mask her disappointment because, of course, he's hideous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she's prepared. It sort of takes her unawares. And that he can't forgive that. He can't get past that.
Interesting. Oh, I like that.
It's such a great twist.
I was obsessed with the Tudors as a child. I remember, so my family are Irish Catholic, and I remember going to my dad. I think we'd gone to church that morning, and I went to my dad. I was like, I want to be a Protestant like Henry VIII, and he was like, no, you can't do that. It's like, why not? And then had like my chicken leg at dinner, just ripping it apart. Like, yeah, I can. I didn't. I did get baptized in the end, but I still hold a grudge to this day.
I'm leaving the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And your reason, darling?
I'm gonna start wearing
like Henry VIII.
Puppies and hunting boar in the summer.
Yeah.
I loved it. I think that's why I like Six so much. When I first heard about it, I was like, this sounds like exactly up my street for sure.
It's so fun. It's such good fun.
Definitely. I am. Should we start? Should we start some questions? Yeah. So first of all, how would you describe your books to somebody who hasn't read them yet?
Okay, so what I would say is that we're all very used to hearing history through the voices of the men. And I've always found the 15th century, the Wars of the Roses period, which is what I write about, very complicated and very baffling. And a lot of historians find it very complicated and very baffling because people do all kinds of bizarre and weird things. And you find yourself thinking all the time, why did he do that? How did he come to do that? How did we end up here? But once you turn everything on its head and you look at events through the eyes of the women that are involved, you think, oh, I see. Because once you understand the motivations of the women, the actions of the men make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Oh, I see why he did that, because she.
Yeah.
So I guess that's what I really wanted to do. I wanted to turn the 15th century, that familiar story of the Wars of the Roses, on its head and tell it through the eyes of the women. Yeah. Because the thing that captivated me about this period so early on, when I'm way back in dinosaur times when I was in my teens, was the fact that there were such powerful women in that period. And yet historians just overlook them all the time, So, yes, so this is history through the eyes of the women who shaped it.
Amazing. I feel like it's so beautiful that so many modern adaptations are coming out with the women as the main focus. Like you've got Margaret of Anjou, who is just a strong, phenomenal woman who was completely ignored throughout. Yes. She was like queen for donkeys. Yeah. And like the country wouldn't be where it is now without her.
I was at a conference last year and there was a historian there, a Tudor historian, quite eminent. I won't name him because that wouldn't be fair. I was very eager to hear what his opinion of Margaret Beaufort was, Henry Tudor's mother. So I asked him, and he looked at me as if I'd fallen out of the sky and said, I've never given the woman a moment's thought.
Wow.
I said, well, do you think you should? Because she is the mother of the Tudor dynasty, and she's not just the mother of the Tudor dynasty because she gave birth to Henry VII. No. She's the mother of the Tudor dynasty because she put him on the throne.
Yeah.
Did Henry VII beat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth? Yes. But he wouldn't even got to the battlefield if it wasn't for his mother.
No.
He'd been out of England since he was 14, he'd been out of England so long, he wouldn't have known how to catch a bus. He didn't know England. It was she who put the whole thing together, It was her that took all the risks. It was her that put herself in danger. She formed the alliances that enabled him to come over from France to England and make war against Richard III. So I always say to people, you know, was it Henry VII that beat Richard III, or was it Margaret Beaufort that beat Cecily?
That's such an interesting take. I feel like, especially with, I mean, it definitely wasn't the first, but it's one of the earliest recorded, I suppose, political campaigns, some might say, for Henry VII, that it was such a contested, the whole War of the Roses was such a contested throne, and it really could have gone any which way. There were too many avenues for it to go down, and had this, for lack of a better word, political campaign not been run by Margaret, where would we be?
Nobody else could have done it.
No.
Nobody else could have done it. And Richard III's big mistake was in 1484, when he found Margaret Beaufort knee deep in treason after the whole, you know, Henry Buckingham debacle. Guilty as hell, red-handed. He shied away from executing her.
Yeah.
Because in good conscience, he didn't feel he could execute a woman.
I mean, it was a win for us, I suppose.
Yeah, but what a loss for him.
No.
Because
it's something to
him, you know.
Yeah, underestimating powerful women. There's a reason why a man always has a wife and a spy master who do the same job.
Yeah.
They can just go and talk, and they're not questioned for talking, because that's what women do. They talk.
What women do. Yeah. There's a great bit in the first book, in Cecily, where Cecily's son Edward, you know, who becomes Edward IV, is talking to Cecily about winning wars, and she says, you know, we don't have swords, Edward. We fight with words, you know, and it's true.
Yeah.
You know, what was really interesting about writing both of these books is, because it's told through the eyes of the women, we can never go to a battlefield. You know, it's the Wars of the Roses. There's battles every 10 minutes. But as a reader, I can't take you there because I'm with the women and they never go.
Yeah.
So it forces you to, as a writer, it forces you to focus on all of the other places where the wars happen and take shape. And it's in bedrooms and the corridors, and, you know.
It's funny, isn't it? Because
it's women do their work.
Yeah, you think that the wars are won on the battlefield, but really the wars are just over on the battlefield. I remember going on a school trip to Bosworth and being walked around the battlefield, and we got taken on this trail about, and this is where he was hung, drawn and quartered and sent down the river. And I was like, oh, great. That's and we were like 10 or something, and it's just such a graphic image to have in a child's mind, and that's all you learn about the war, is the big fights.
Yeah. And there's so much more, isn't there?
Yeah.
So much more to it.
There's a reason why, like, royal dramas and period dramas that are set in court are full of so much skullduggery, because that is the main thing that happens. The war, the fighting happens, sure, but not nearly as often.
Yeah.
It is all just dinners and bedroom discussions and everything. So
influencing people. You know, it's Cecily and Margaret in particular, and these women, they were masters of what we would call spin. You know, they're propagandists. They understand how to tell a story that's going to influence people and get things done the way they want them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Done, you know.
I think Shakespeare was really good for portraying the women as, you know, these, I mean, they were often vilified and whatnot, but portraying the women as strong as they were.
Yeah, I'm rather cross with Shakespeare about Cecily, though.
Yeah.
Because when you think about it, of those big four women who are in The King's Mother, you know, there's Marguerite of Anjou, Margaret Beaufort, Elizabeth Woodville, and Cecily Neville. And the names we're most familiar with are Marguerite, Margaret, and Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And yet Cecily is the most powerful of all four. And, you know, she's the woman, you know, she was born in 1415, the year of Agincourt, lived until 1495, you know, 80 years. So saw a dynasty rise, saw it fall. All of that 80 years really close to the political centre of power, calling the shots. For most of her life, the most powerful woman in England.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, you ask people, you mentioned Cecily, and they go, who? And it's only when you say, oh, you know, Richard III's mum. And people go, oh, okay. Yeah. Cecily's kind of forgotten. And I could never understand that. When I was growing up and got fascinated by all of this, I kept trying to sort of get a handle on these women and get a handle on Cecily. And she just kept sort of sliding away. You couldn't find, nothing much had been written about her. There hadn't even been an official biography, an academic study, or anything of that kind. And I went looking in Shakespeare, and I realized that, you know, Shakespeare didn't do Richard III any favors, but he didn't do Cecily any either, because in the Shakespeare history plays, Cecily is old and pious and dull, and she doesn't have anything to say. She has no agency, no power. No one's listening to her. She just wanders around complaining about how awful her kids are and how it's not her fault. And I think for 500 years, everyone's gone, oh, well, that's Cecily. She's a bit boring, isn't she? Oh, look, isn't Elizabeth Woodville sexy? Let's talk about her, you know. So,
but, yeah, it comes with, I suppose a lot of it does span from Shakespeare. I imagine a lot of our history has come from what he's written.
Yeah.
And he was in a point where, you know, had Richard III held the throne, potentially we would have a completely different story to tell.
You'd had a very different first folio, that's for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Because two things, Shakespeare was writing for a Tudor audience and a Tudor patron. So, but also
wouldn't have been great on his part to
no, he might have found himself in trouble.
Richard III is a hero.
Great guy. There's another thing to say in Tudor England. But also, you know, he wasn't writing history. He was writing drama, you know. If you walked up to William Shakespeare now and said, yeah, but what about the historical accuracy? You said, what?
Yeah.
I'm not interested in that. I'm telling stories.
Exactly. I feel like it's so difficult when you've got the most famous way or most famous portrayal of these historical characters painted in with such bias, like created with such bias and necessary bias at the time, but it's very hard to separate that and actually find the proper history when you've been told for 500 years how someone
hunchback, child murdering tyrant.
Yes, absolutely.
It's really hard to get past it.
Yeah.
Even now, when we've got the physical evidence of his body having been found under the car park in Leicester and all of that, and we know he wasn't hunchback and deformed and with a arm and a limp. We know for an absolute fact that he wasn't. And yet people still have that image in their head. You still hear historians saying it. What? You know.
It's just interesting how I do wonder sometimes if we had modern technology the way we do now, if we had even a semblance of that back then, how different things would be and how things, I mean, even just a photo of these people would be so interesting. Because we have no idea how they actually look.
No. And that's interesting too, because in England at that crucial time, portraiture was very basic. You know, if you looked at a picture of a queen, it was always long blonde hair and the oval face. They all looked exactly the same. If you were in, let's say, Bruges, in what was then Burgundy, a very sophisticated court where there was a sort of, the Renaissance came there earlier than it hit in England. So lots of Cecily's contemporaries who lived in Burgundy, we have the most fantastic representational portraiture of. Fantastic. I mean, Holbein-like, you know. we don't have it in England.
No.
Not until Hans Holbein, really.
Mm.
You know, and it's such a loss. What might those Burgundian artists have made of Cecily, you know?
No, it is so interesting, especially when you've got, because the portraiture is so simple, they all look so different as well, that you can't really tell one from the other.
No.
It's each, I mean, you have so many artists at that time as well who drew the same painting.
Yeah.
But what's one from the other? They're completely different, and yet they're exactly the same.
Yeah.
So which one is the most true to form? We will never know.
No. No.
Yeah.
It's a great frustration of mine.
Yeah, I can imagine. Mine too. I reckon I'm gonna sleep tonight and just think, what is it? What do they look like?
Yeah. But I mean, I think that the portrait that comes closest, I think, to being modern in that sense, or developed in that sense, is there's a fantastic picture of Elizabeth Woodville in the National Gallery. I don't know if you've seen it.
I haven't.
It's just extraordinary. And the fashion at the time was for women to pluck their foreheads to about here. They'd, you know, like we pluck our eyebrows out, they would literally pluck their foreheads to here. So that, and it would give them this sort of moon-like face. And they, you know, they went for really pale skin. And that was the fashion. And this portrait of Elizabeth Woodville, she's got this incredibly high forehead, all plucked. And what's left of her hair is pulled back into a little gold cap. And she has that perfect sort of medieval face, the rosebud lips, a neck that's, you know, long, sort of elegant neck. And I have to say, I have sat for hours looking at that photograph, that portrait, because she looks so inscrutable. Yeah. And she is so beautiful in that weird medieval sort of way, you know, that, yeah. No one, yes, no wonder a king fell in love with you.
Yeah, you know? Absolutely. So you said you've had the idea in your head for so long. When you first came up with the concept, what came first within the story, and what underwent the most change?
Oh wow! Well, I mean, it all started for me when I was in my teens. My mum was always a great reader of historical fiction, so I used to read historical fiction with her, you know. So that idea that history and story are very close was kind of part of my DNA from childhood, really. And then I went to school, and I went to a very, really quite bad comprehensive school in the north of England, you know, not very high achieving school. But I looked out because I had a fantastic history teacher, and you know how it can happen in any subject. Yeah. For me, it was history. You just get someone who's, you know, and he was teaching Wars of the Roses, and I was just gripped because he taught history like it happened yesterday, and you know, and he talked about the people, you know, when lots of teachers were just force feeding kids with dates and facts and boring shit.
This is what you need on your exam.
Yeah, this stuff you need in your exam. He'd be asking the important questions like, well, what do you think he was thinking? Well, why do you think she did that when he'd already done, you know, all those sorts of questions. So I was just glued to it, and he just kept throwing books at me all the time and saying, read that. Because I think he was so unused to having a student who was actually interested in his subject, because most of his pupils were either nicking off or they were asleep. So, and occasionally he'd give me a novel to read. And he gave me a novel called We Speak No Treason by Rosemary Hawley Jarman, which is all about Richard III. And it's a bit romantic. It's a good Richard, not the hunchback tyrant one. And I was about, I don't know, 14, I suppose. And my teenage heart was ready for it. And I had a huge crush on Richard III. Which is very worrying for my mum. She kept saying, you do know he's dead, don't you? And so, I mean, I remain interested in Richard, but not in a romantic way. But the more as I started getting a bit older, and more aware of myself as a woman, I suppose.
Yeah.
I just became far more interested in the women around Richard, because they are infinitely more interesting than the men.
Absolutely.
And they are making, as we were saying earlier, it's them that are making shit happen.
Yeah.
So that idea of writing The Wars of the Roseless from the female point of view came to me, I guess, really by the time I was in my early 20s. The idea was in my head. And my idea was I would leave university and get a job in publishing and write at the same time. And I thought that would be lovely. I'll be working with books all day, and then I'll be writing books at night and weekends. Marvelous. That was the plan. And it almost worked out, because I did get a job in publishing.
Amazing.
But this was back in the 1980s, at a time when, I don't know what it's like now, but then it seemed to me that all the young women working in publishing were called Polly or Fiona, and they were engaged to Rupert. Or they had a trust fund from Daddy.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter that they earned, tuppence a week, because they weren't in it for the money.
They could afford to go home and write in the evenings.
Yeah. And I had neither a trust fund nor a Rupert. So I was working at pubs at night and bookshops at the weekend just to make a living, pay rent. So I thought, I need a plan B. So I kind of did a deal with the devil and said, well, I'll go into business proper, into business where I can make a living. But at 55, whatever the day job is, I will give it up and write this story. And that's what I did. And it was a tough decision and a hard decision at the time. But I'm so glad I did, because the one thing that really changed in all of those years was, I found myself working in business and getting higher and higher up the tree. And I would often find myself, particularly in the latter years of my career, being the only woman in the boardroom or the only woman at the big table, working out what I needed to do and say to get the blokes to do what I needed them to do.
Interesting.
And I thought, I am learning all of the techniques that these women learned 500-600 years ago about how to get things done in a world where men seem to have all the power cards.
Yeah.
Nothing much has changed. So I'm really glad now, looking back at it, I'm really glad.
Yeah, definitely.
That I waited. Because I think if I'd written these books in my 20s, they'd probably have been rubbish.
Do you think they would have been? I think they would have had tweaking done, but I don't think they would have been rubbish.
They'd certainly have been very different.
Was there anything from a side? I mean, you've obviously mentioned the boardroom side of things, but with business, did you find that, having spent so long in that industry, there were things that you took there in terms of, I don't know, like self-discipline or anything like that you used in your writing?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Yeah, two things I'd say. First of all, in the last 15, 20 years of my career, I was working for myself, running my own business. And when you own business, you don't turn up to work, you don't get paid, right? So there's a huge motivation to hit the desk and be at work.
Yeah.
So that sort of work ethic that just says, you turn up at 8:30 in the morning and you leave when the work is done, whether that's at 5 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night, that's when you stop working, right? And that's what you do. So that sort of self-discipline is really helpful when you're a writer, because, you hear a lot of people saying, oh, I couldn't write today, I just wasn't feeling inspired, or, I'm waiting for the muse. Well, that's not going to happen. It's graft. You just have to show up every day and do it, And sometimes you'll get to the end of the day and you'll have had a really great day and you might have written, 500 or 1,000 words that you're happy with. Sometimes you'll end the day and you think, I haven't even got a decent sentence. You just have to do it every day. So that's the first thing, that sort of discipline that gets you to the desk every day and doing it. That has definitely helped. But the other thing I would really say is that for me in particular, because I spent most of my career in marketing and corporate communications, I spent a lot of my time writing, communicating.
Yeah.
And the sort of skill when you're in marketing or corporate comms or PR, it's being able to sit back and think, okay, so I know what I want the reader to do, the person to do, my audience. I want them to buy this product or invest in this business or accept this change program or, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So what are the things that I need to say to make them do that, to make them feel that? I want them to trust this company. What do I need to say to make them trust? How do I create a response or an emotion or a commitment? That's a really useful thing to know as a novelist.
Yeah, I bet.
Because you think, I want them to cry at this bit. Now, what have I got to say to make them cry? I want them to really root for this character. What have I got to say to make them really care about this character? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
That for me was really, really, really a useful tool that I've developed for my business, not knowing that in the future it hadn't occurred to me that this was an issue in novel writing as well. But of course it is.
It's something that you wouldn't even think twice about, isn't it?
Yeah. And again, I didn't know that in my 20s.
No. I am with I can't remember what I was going to say. I'm so fascinated. When it came to leaving your job to write the book, was that easy to step away to do it? Because you've wanted to do it for so long.
Yeah.
Was it like, I've finally reached this point, now time?
It was terrifying in one way, but but easy in another. It was terrifying because for so long I've been saying, oh, well, in 20 years time, in 15 years time, in 10 years time, in 5, in a couple of years. And then suddenly it was February 2017 and I was approaching 55 and I thought, shit, well, it's now.
Yeah.
And then I had to think, well, can I do it? Have I got it in me to do it, to write a decent book that someone will want to publish? So that was scary. But in another way, I really enjoyed my career. I had a great time. But by the time I hit 55, I was done.
Yeah.
I've had it. So in one respect, it was easy. In another way, it was really terrifying. But it was very liberating as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. Definitely.
And I mean, the one thing I would say to any woman today is, we're all going to have at least 2 careers, aren't we? Because we're all going to have to, the way the economy is, we're all going to have to work till about 93. So
they just keep up in that age, don't they?
Yeah. So you'd better plan on having a couple of careers because otherwise you're just going to get bored. So you might as well fit the writing one in there somewhere. Everything is possible.
Yes.
You just have to want it.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's something that people need to hear as well, don't they?
Yeah.
There's no doubt so many people sat at home now thinking, God, I want to write this book. And it's so easy, especially when you have work that gets in the way or your life seems to get in the way. It's so easy to just be like, I'll do it tomorrow or I'll do it the next day. And you do just put it off.
Yeah.
And especially if it comes to self-critique.
Yeah.
And not liking what you've put on paper.
Yeah.
Just keep at it. Just keep changing it, tweaking what you need to do, as long as you're doing it.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, the most important person to do it for is you.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
I'd love that. I should probably say hello to everyone who's joined us. Hello, everybody. This is Annie.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming.
I forgot to mention earlier, in the activities section, there is a little triangle, a square and a circle, and there's a function called Q&A, where you'll be able to type any questions you want, and I will happily read them out to the wonderful Annie. They can be about her process, about Cecily or the King's mother, yeah, anything you like, and we will get asking. But yeah, we've kind of talked about what drew you to historical fiction, but in terms of Cecily, was it because that there wasn't anything really about her? Was there any other, not necessarily even woman, any other historical character that really captivated you and made you want to write about them?
Yeah, well, you know, it's the whole cast of characters in the books, really, and particularly the women.
Yeah,
I guess the first book, Cecily, is very focused on Cecily herself. You know, it's the story of one woman. And then the second book, The King's Mother, really opens it out to those big 4 key players, you know, who at one point or another are going to do really quite questionable things in their attempts to become King's Mother themselves.
Yes.
You know, and it's again, the idea that sort of formulated in my head over all those years was, this is not a war that is fought on battlefields. This is a war that is fought mentally by these 4 women.
Yeah.
And you find yourself thinking about what motivates them, and in part it's survival. And you know, the one thing they have in common is that they are all mothers, and they are all the mothers of sons. And I guess the question at the heart of the novel is, what would you do? How far would you go in order to secure your children's future?
Yeah. And
that's a question that any woman who is a mother has had to face at some point. Perhaps not on such a grandiose scale. In every way, you know, they've had to. And it turns out that the list of what you wouldn't do is really short. You can do just about anything. You know, it is extraordinary. So that's the question that's at the heart of these novels. And then these 4 women with their very different characters, how do they tackle that? Yeah,
I think
and they will all betray each other.
Yeah, absolutely. They're not friends by any stretch, are they? No. I think it's so interesting, isn't it? Where it's a race to the throne, but not even for yourself.
Yeah.
Which makes it so much different. Yeah. Because it isn't, while I suppose part of it is for personal success, to secure your family and everything, it really is about the success of your child.
Yes.
Yeah.
And where does one slip into the other, you know, because if their son is king, well, they're king's mum, right? Which is pretty cool. Yeah. Being. Yeah. So where does that sort of maternal drive for the survival of your children flip over into personal ambition?
Yeah, absolutely.
How closely linked are they? There's a whole great area there, isn't there? Which I find fascinating, you know.
Yeah. What was when following history, what was the most challenging part about bringing it to paper in terms of creative license and following like historical record, especially where there were, I mean, particularly with Cecily, there's such a huge gap in the historical record about who she is and what her life was. How was that to kind of navigate in your work?
Yeah, I find this is really interesting. I get a bit Star Trek about the history. So far as we know what happened, I think we need to stick to it, you know, rather than invent or change what we know. So, you know, so if we know that something happened, if we know for sure that something happened in a certain way at a certain time that these people involved, well, let's not mess with that.
No.
You know. But the interesting thing about this period, about anything in the Middle Ages, really, I guess, is that there are so many things that we just don't know that
Mhm.
weren't recorded, or where the reports are so divergent and so conflicting that in the end you just have to look at it and say, well, if we know that, and we know that, but we don't know what happened in between, what's plausible, what's likely, and sift through what we know and just arrive at what is plausible and likely and be true to that. That's what I try to. Hilary Mantel, who wrote the Wolf Hall novels, who I worship like a god, I think she's just extraordinary. She said a fascinating thing about history. She said history is no more the past than a birth certificate or is a child, or a map is a journey. She said it's just what got written down. And she said it's what's left in the bottom of the sieve when all the waters of time have flown through it. And it's scripts and scraps and bits that have survived, and it's always incomplete, and it's always biased, and it's frequently wrong.
I love that.
But that's what we've got to work with, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is just so brilliant. And as a novelist, it's so liberating.
Yeah, definitely.
We know that Henry VII beat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. We don't know what Cecily said to her husband in bed.
No, exactly.
But we can make a pretty shrewd guess. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what keeps me interested.
Amazing.
And I think that's the challenge for historical. Is when I found myself thinking a lot when I was writing about how do you create suspense when you're writing a story that everyone knows what happened, where everyone knows what happened at the end. You know, how do you get? Because as a writer, you want people sitting up at 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, even when they've got to get up early to go to work the next day, because they've just got to read the next chapter, the next page. You know, turn the next page, and you can't. And everyone knows what's going to happen. So what I learned is that the only way you can do that is to get people completely invested in the characters. So they're not reading to find out what happens because they probably know. They're reading to find out what it felt like. You know, they're reading it to find out what Cecily felt like when her children died, or Edward became king, or, you know, those great turning points in her life. What was it like?
Yeah.
You know,
it is that hidden narrative, isn't it? She had feelings and she had thoughts, but nobody knows what they are.
Yeah, it's fascinating at the moment because I'm researching a new book, as I mentioned to you when I came on the call. And at the moment, so I've been in the research phase for about a year now. And at first it feels quite, you know, I'm learning the facts, I'm learning the history, I'm absorbing what happened. And then it's really only happened in the last 3 months, and it's where the magic bit starts. Because I've started to build these characters in my head. Yeah. And I'm starting to have theories about why they are the way they are and what their psychology is.
Yeah.
Their motivations and things like that, which you're not going to read in the history books.
No.
You know, you have to, that's the magic that happens in history, you know. And then I get really excited. You know, it's just so fabulous. Yeah, and I'm at that good bit now with this new book.
Amazing. I am. When it comes to with Cecily in particular, I suppose, did her character kind of come to you instantly? Did you know who she was and what she would think? And because I suppose you spent so long with her.
Yeah.
When you were working in business, how did you still research, or was it more on the back burner and just something you had a passion?
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Because in many ways I say to people, you know, so how long did it take you to research the books? And I said, well, about 40 years. Because in a way I was researching all that time because it was just what I was really interested in. So I wasn't researching intensely like I am now, for example, book 3, but I was constantly reading everything and looking at everything and thinking about it all the time. So her character in my head developed over a long period of time.
Yeah.
You know, and just when you start reading between the lines of, because often with a character like Cecily, who hasn't been much written about, the way that you get to understand them is by reading about what the men are up to, what her men are doing, and how she's responding and reacting to them, and then making some guesses and assumptions. And then I was lucky because in 2017, just when I was sitting down seriously to write, a woman called Joanna Lane Smith, who's she's an Oxford academic and a specialist in medieval women, and she wrote a biography of Cecily, which I obviously read, and went and met her, and we talked for hours about Cecily. And it was brilliant because she reinforced many of the conclusions that I had reached. That Cecily was a real power player, that she was very much relied upon by her husband,
Yeah,
subsequently by her sons. Excuse me.
sorry.
I've had this niggly cough for about 3 weeks.
Oh, yeah, it's all in the air, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Definitely something nasty going around.
Yeah.
Mm.
Sorry.
It's okay.
But when you look at the history, all the hints are there.
Mm-hmm.
There are wonderful letters between her and her husband where she's clearly advising him.
Yeah.
It's clearly her. And then he comes back to for advice.
Amazing.
But the real clincher for me, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
At the point where Edward is becoming king, and he wins the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, and he comes to London, where Cecily is, holding the fort, and he accepts the throne. There's no time for a coronation or anything like that because there's another army in the north waiting to fight him. So he's got to leg it north and go and fight again.
Yeah.
Who does he leave in control of his new kingdom? His mum.
Yeah.
He makes her head of his household, which is effectively his regent, and she's running the show.
Yeah.
While he's off throwing his sword around, she's keeping all the plates spinning and all the balls in the air, and she's doing it. And there's some fantastic, you can imagine what it was like in London at that time, everyone trying to work out who's going to win, what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And all the European ambassadors are in London, flashing around in Westminster trying to find out what's going on. And then writing back to their masters in Europe to say, what's happening. And there's a great letter, and it basically says, and I paraphrase, but it's one of the ambassadors writing back into Europe, and he says, so here's what's happening in England. It is regime change, and it looks like Edward's going to be king, and that's great because the people worship him like he's a god. But if we want to do business in England, we need to do it with his mother. And that just tells you everything you need to know about Cecily, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because she rules the king as she will.
Yeah.
And that just gives you such an insight, I think.
Absolutely.
And in a way, it's not surprising because, at that point, Edward is 18, really good with the sword, good looking and handsome and all of that good stuff. Didn't really expect to be a king, not really prepared for it. Cecily, by this point in her 40s, with 30 years, 20, 30 years of political experience under her belt, who else are you going to leave in charge?
Yeah, exactly.
She's super smart, super experienced, and who are you going to trust more than your mum?
Exactly. And he's barely an adult.
Yeah. So, 18.
Yeah. I think it's also fascinating. I am going to ask some viewer questions.
Yeah.
So Carrie has said, is there any character in either book that when you started writing, loved, but by the time you had finished writing the book, you had fallen out of love with?
Oh.
or anyone that you went in thinking you would love, but actually writing them out, you didn't?
Well, I sort of had that experience in reverse with Margaret Beaufort.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I'm a Yorkist. Right? I wanted Richard III to win, right? So Margaret's always been a bit of a bête noire. But writing her, I came to like her and admire her so much.
Yeah.
Because she's so brave and she takes such risks.
Yeah.
And she's so smart and she's so and she's so like Cecily.
Yeah.
You know, the two of them, for intelligence and determination and wit, you couldn't put a bus ticket between them. You know,
No,
they're so alike.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't help but admire her determination.
Yeah.
So yeah, against my will and my better judgment, I really came to love her.
It's a shame that they were born on opposite sides.
Yeah.
Because what a powerhouse they could be.
Yeah.
No one's
so many years they were such good friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and they were cousins. They were, you know, the same family.
Yeah.
And I think they genuinely loved each other. And you know, Margaret was that bit younger. You know, she was the next generation down, wasn't she, really? And I think she admired Cecily and looked up to her as a role model.
Yeah.
And sort of, you know, she says somewhere in the book, you know, I've been studying your game for years. You know, she has.
Yeah.
And when you look in history, Cecily was the first woman to take the king's mother as a sort of formal title rather than just a historical fact. You know?
Yeah.
She kind of made that role her own. And when Margaret Beaufort comes along and Henry VII is finally king, she takes that title too. And it's very clear that she's modeling her behavior, modeling the way that she handles that role on Cecily's, you know. It's great. Like I did just feel at the end of the book that it, you know, Margaret betrayed Cecily, but it really cost her to do it.
Yeah.
It was painful to do. Yeah. So yeah, I learned to love Margaret.
I love that. It's nice that I feel like with every character, especially if you write them, you kind of have to love them in some way, right?
Yeah.
To get them across as like a fully rounded character.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you found some redeemable things to like about her.
Yeah, she's amazing.
G says, how did you research the book? I love this period and always felt there is more to the Princes in the Tower, especially with Tudor propaganda and people like Virgil. But modern historians strongly argue Richard killed them despite the contradictions in his behaviour, or did you use artistic license more?
Right. There is a lot of the idea of Richard killing the princes in the towers. I've never been convinced by that. Never. And it always seemed out of character for him. And it seemed pointless too. Because if he was going to kill them as a way to, you know, I can see that he had a motive, but the only way for him to make any advantage out of killing them was to show that they were dead. No?
Yeah.
Oh, look, poor things, they died. Here are their bodies, dead. Right, okay, let's move on. He never did.
No.
So he gained nothing.
No.
If he did kill them, he gained nothing from doing so.
And also, surely the moniker that comes with being a child killer is not worth it.
Exactly. And also, you know,
in your favour.
Yeah, we were saying earlier that Richard scrupled to execute Margaret Beaufort when she was knee deep in treason because she was a woman. So is the man who scrupled to execute a woman a proven traitor gonna kill his nephews?
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense. And then there's a whole lot of evidence that has come out in the last few years, particularly, that suggests that not only did Richard not kill them, but nobody killed them at all. That they were alive well into the Tudor period. And who was the lady that asked the question?
G.
Yeah, I'd really advise you, G, to read Philippa Langley's work on this, on the missing princes. She has led the most fantastic project over the last 5 years or so. And what she did, she took the premise of it was brilliant because she used modern technology. She used crowdsourcing, basically. And she recruited archivists all over Europe and just said, go to your archives, go wherever and look. Come back and bring me anything that you find, however, whatever it is that mentions the princes in the tower, anything. And off they all went. And the things they found are astonishing.
Yeah.
And it's evidence of survival beyond 1485 for both boys.
Yeah.
And we know that Henry VII, when he became king, destroyed documents and records of Richard's reign. He could do that in England. But the interesting evidence that Philip has been finding is coming from the Low Countries and from France, places where Henry couldn't get to. And
that's interesting.
So, is any one of those things that she's found an absolute silver bullet that says they were definitely alive? Maybe not. You could argue for and against on every case, but there is so much of it that you put all of that together on the scales, and it is so compelling.
Yeah.
So for me, the case is proven that he didn't kill them. And also, the other thing that is interesting in this, and it comes back to Cecily, is that there is precedent for how you would treat those two boys. Because a couple of generations previously, we're getting deep into history here, but when Henry IV took the throne from Richard II, and he came and won by conquest, there were actually two young boys, two brothers, who it was acknowledged throughout England had a better claim to the throne than Henry IV. That was two Mortimer brothers. But they were boys, and, who's going to prefer them to the great Marshal Henry IV, who just won all the battles? Well, nobody really. So what's Henry going to do? Is he going to kill those boys? They're rivals to his throne. They've got a better claim than he has. Surely he'd kill them. He doesn't. They're similar in age to the two princes, and he takes them into custody and he places them in noble households and, lets them live. And one of the brothers, happens to die of natural causes anyway, but the other one, who survives into adulthood, becomes so loyal to Henry IV and is rewarded, and he's ennobled, and he, becomes a good servant of the king. So much so that at one point there is a rebellion to try and put him on the throne. And he goes to Henry IV and says, I just want you to know that this is going on and that it's got nothing to do with me. It's him, and him. So, and Cecily knew that story very well, because one of the guys who was then executed for leading that rebellion, who was the father of her husband. So she knew this story. It's part of her family story. So when Richard III is going, what am I going to do about the princes? She's going to say, well, we'll do what Henry IV did with the Mortimer boys, right?
Yeah.
We'll take them into close custody with men that we trust, change their world outlook, and hope that they grow up content with their new lot. That's what she's going to be saying. She's going to be saying, we don't need to kill them, Richard. Here's what we're going to do.
Yeah. So fascinating. It's so interesting that even though such a long time has passed, that we're able to still find things out and new things, and it's
Brilliant, isn't it?
yeah, it's
So
really crazy.
Yeah.
And completely fascinating how much of history is preserved and how little of it we know.
Yeah.
He also says, are you planning on writing any more historical novels? Which brings us back to the little conversation we had before the call.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny this one because I am, yes, but I'm almost surprised at myself because for all of these years I've been saying, at 55 I'm going to give up work and I'm going to write this stuff, and I've been saying, I'm going to write Cecily's story. I haven't been saying at 55 I'm going to give up work and become a novelist.
Yeah,
I've been saying I'm going to write Cecily's story. So as I was coming to the end of writing The King's Mother, I found myself thinking, oh, so is that it then? Once this is done, am I finished? Do I then go and do something else? Do I become a sheep farmer or something? Like a new career, or am I a writer now? Am I a novelist now? And I genuinely wasn't sure.
Yeah.
And then I was having a coffee with my editor, talking about The King's Mom. And she said, so, have you got an idea for a third novel? And I found myself saying, well, there's this Isabella woman. And she said, oh, so who's Isabella? Tell me about Isabella. And I said, well, she's, the Queen of Edward II, who, as far as kings would go, was top of the useless pile. And she comes over from France when she's about 12 to marry him. He's hopeless. And eventually she deposes him. First time an English king has been deposed, and it's his wife that does it. And she maybe murders him, I'm not sure. And she just leaned across the table and she said, we'll contract for that right now.
Oh, wow.
So I suddenly found myself signing a contract to write Isabella. Oh, okay. Maybe I do want to be a novelist then.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's so magical. Amazing. And then how so you said that the characters are now developing in your mind. Is there any of it that you've started writing? No. That's so fair.
Yeah, but I will. It's getting quite, my fingers are starting to itch now.
Yeah.
I think I'll be ready to actually start writing in the next 2 months.
Amazing.
I found myself lying in bed, not sleeping a couple of nights ago, and writing chapter 1 in my head. That felt quite good.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
I imagine it must feel so strange stepping away from Cecily.
Yes, because she's been such a huge part of my life for so long. Yeah.
I suppose at least with in The King's Mother, you got to explore other powerful women as well. And so perhaps that helped slightly.
Yeah, definitely does.
Yeah.
Dilutes her a bit in my head.
No, I'm very excited about it. I've not heard of her before.
Oh, she's amazing.
Yeah, she sounds it.
Yeah.
Amazing. Sophie says, what's the most surprising thing you learned while writing your books, either related to history or yourself?
Oh gosh. I'll tell you the thing that I learned that sort of surprised me, and yet when you think about it, it's totally obvious, is that when you're researching history, you spend a lot of time with the books. With the books, reading the history. You can see my desk at the just to my left here. There are heaps of books about Isabella in the 14th century and all of that good stuff for the next book. And you spend a lot of time talking to historians.
Yeah.
But I felt very strongly that I wanted to go and see some of the places where this shit happened, right? And that felt important to me, just to get a feeling for place and a lay of the land and landscape and the sensations of moving in these spaces. And
of course.
And I live very close to Ludlow, where a lot of the action, particularly in Cecily, happens. So I'd often find myself sitting in Ludlow, imagining. So I did take myself off to lots of different places. And that's when you find the things that you weren't looking for, that just come along as a gift. And there's a great example of that. I wanted to go to Trim in Ireland because Richard and Cecily spent a few years there at one point in their lives. So I felt I really wanted to go, and it was quite fun. It was my partner's birthday coming up, and I said, "Oh, do you fancy going away for your birthday?" She said, "Oh yeah, where were you thinking?" I said, "Well, I'm thinking Ireland. Do you fancy going to Ireland?" She said, "Yeah, where?" And I said, "Well, Trim. I think Trim." And she said, "Okay, so what exactly did Cecily do in Trim?" I'd been rumbled. So off we went to Trim, and I had a great time. I went with a huge list of things that I wanted to see and people I wanted to speak to and things I wanted to find out. But on her actual birthday, I thought, well, I better let her do what she wants to do. So
yeah,
it's her birthday after all. And she wanted to go on a big walk up. There's a fabulous hill just outside Trim called the Hill of Tara. And we walked up the hill, and it was stunning. And it's meant to be the sort of, the centre of ancient Ireland, where you could look and see all the counties of Ireland behind you and all that great stuff. And when we were at the top of the hill, there was a fabulous woman, a sort of tour guide, giving a talk to a bunch of people about the Hill of Tara and its history. And we sort of just earwigged in to listen. And she's telling the story of Maeve, Queen of the World, this Irish legendary princess.
Yeah.
And she told such a great story about Maeve. And I thought, oh, I'm having that.
Yeah.
I want that. And that became a motif. The story of Maeve became a motif all the way through the first book, Cecily. And Cecily and Richard ride up to the Hill of Tara, and they're told the story of Maeve. And it resonates through the whole book.
Yeah.
I didn't go to Trim to look for that.
No.
I just found it. So, this idea of just get away from the desk, get in, go, walk in the spaces and see what you discover.
It's such a gorgeous idea. Was there anywhere in particular that where you visited for the locations? Was there anywhere in particular that just I'm so sorry, I can't get my words out. That you felt like, yeah, okay, I know exactly what I want here.
Yeah.
And I can feel what's happened and what I want to put down.
Yeah.
Was there anywhere that stood out for just the location alone?
Yeah, I feel that really intensely at Ludlow.
Yeah.
It is such. If you haven't been, you've got to come. It is so magical.
Yeah.
It's so fantastic. And Ludlow Castle is brilliant. It's obviously a ruin, but it's quite a complete ruin. So it still feels, you can still visualize very easily how people moved through it and lived in it. And, it looks almost complete. And and so much happened in Ludlow. Fateful night when Marguerite's army came to Ludlow, and Richard, Duke of York, and his sons ran, and Cecily was left to face the music. And I have walked across that very bridge that they would have fled across and up into the hills from Ludlow, and I've walked all of that. And I guess that's the place where I feel closest to Cecily than anywhere else in the world. But I did have a lovely experience last year when The King's Mother came out in hardback. I was invited to speak at Fotheringay Church, which is where Cecily and Richard are buried.
Yeah.
So literally, I was there talking about Cecily, and her tomb was sort of right beside me.
Wow.
That felt Yeah, that was really, that was such a magical gift.
I can imagine. That sounds so special. I am with Cecily, and with Cecily going into the King's Mother, how was it writing her as like a potential claimant to then becoming the King's Mother, or like striving to be the King's Mother?
You mean, how did I feel about her ambition, or
yeah, like how did it develop from, you know, it being Cecily and Richard to it being, oh, Cecily and her sons?
Ah, right, yes. I guess my overall feeling with Richard and Cecily, her husband, and her husband, was that if Henry VI had been a halfway decent king, they'd have been perfectly content to be loyal subjects, you know, and they were the leading noble couple in their time, and that would have been more than enough. And everyone would have got to die in their beds, and it would all have been fine.
Yeah.
But Henry VI was an appalling king, and inevitably, then, when you have very weak men in control, you know, they're surrounded by a sort of cabal of people who dominate them and influence them in all kinds of perverse ways, and that became a direct threat to Richard and to Cecily.
Yeah.
And I guess that brings the whole question into place, you know. At some point, you have either got to, you're faced with a really stark choice. You've either got to take power, or the people who have the power are going to destroy you.
Yes.
And I think that's the point that Richard and Cecily came to. And I think that was a harder decision for Richard than it was for Cecily.
Yes.
But that's where they were, and they had to act. And then, of course, Richard was killed, and Cecily then has to focus on her sons for their survival, you know. And it's a bitter thing, because the interesting thing for me is that Cecily, and I think that's where the drama in the relationship between Richard and Cecily really comes from, because Cecily was, her parents were Ralph, Earl of Westmoreland, and John Beaufort, who was the half sister of Henry IV. And Ralph, Cecily's dad, was the first English nobleman to declare for Henry IV when he took the throne from Richard II. So that idea that a good nobleman had justification for taking the throne away from a weak, corrupt king was kind of her "what did you do in the war, daddy" story. That's what she was grew up in. So when she was suddenly faced with Henry VI as a weak, corrupt, useless king, doing bad things for the country but threatening her family, she was, I imagine Cecily going, "Richard, like, you know what we need to do, right? We need to do what Dad did, right?" Yes.
Just the only thing that makes sense.
It's the only thing that makes sense. But Richard, whose father was executed as a traitor, is sitting there going, "Yes, I know, and I know you're right, but I really don't want to be a traitor because I know how that ends."
Yeah.
You know. And there's a point in the book where she says to Richard, "You're only a traitor if you lose." You know.
Yeah. Oh, poor Richard.
It's great stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's such like a, what's the word? You're constantly on like knife's edge. Balancing about which way you're going to fall. And you just hope that you land on your feet, I suppose. But there's always a chance that it's just so interesting, because it really could have gone any which way. And
that's another interesting thing that I learned as well, and actually that my mum taught me, is that, you know, it's almost impossible for us not to know that Henry, the Tudors win in the end, right?
Yeah.
Because it's history, right? So it's really difficult for us to put ourselves in the position of not knowing. And I remember years and years and years ago talking to my mum when she was still alive about World War II, which of course she lived through. And we talked about it, and she looked at me and she said, "The thing is, Annie, we didn't know we were going to win." And it was like an absolute bolt of the blue, you know, one of those glimpses of the obvious that just hits you on the head. And of course I didn't know. We can't not know that we won World War II. Hitler was defeated and all of that. We can't imagine what it's like.
No, not at all.
Didn't know. And like all the time I was writing these books, I found myself listening to my mum saying that and trying to, when I write these characters, put myself in that position of just not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen next year, what the eventual outcome is going to be. Because if you can't get yourself into that position, you can't write in any way that's compelling.
No, definitely. I feel like I didn't even consider how difficult that must have been, because the story is there, the bare bones of the story is there, but how do you not guess the ending when you know what happens?
Yeah, because there must have been, you know, there were so many cases, so many instances, times when it must have seemed to Cecily that there was just no way that she could win. Just no way that she could win. You know, that terrible Christmas when her husband and Edmund were killed. Edward was a million miles away in Wales and Marguerite was at the door. Surely she can't have expected to win. But she did.
So it's just hope, isn't it? It's such a key part. Hope and careful planning.
And her terror.
Yes, absolutely.
The terror that you would feel.
There's something about fear keeping you alive as well. Definitely. I can't even begin to imagine what it must have been like to be so terrified every day, but have to be so strong at the same time.
Yeah.
It is genuinely so. I keep saying it's fascinating, but it truly is so fascinating.
Yeah.
We've got another question. Okay, so G has written back, using my work account, hence the G, though it is Gemma. Hello, Gemma. One last question. Any advice for a budding historical fiction writer? I'm currently a history teacher, but thinking of next steps. I'm more an early modernist, though. I do fancy a take on another Isabella of Castile, though.
Oh, Isabella of Castile. Yes. Edward the First's queen.
I believe so.
Yeah. Well, I think what it comes down to, what I say to every budding writer of historical fiction is, you have to know the history inside out, back to front, upside down, thoroughly. You have to research it to the nth degree, and then you almost have to set that aside. You know, you sometimes read historical fiction, and it is so stuffed full of historical detail that it feels shoehorned in. And it's almost as if the author is thinking, I've researched this and I know it is really interesting, so it's going in. Right? Yeah. Avoid that like the plague. Because you have to have just enough of the historical detail. Hilary Mantel used to call it the furniture, you know, the mental furniture. Just enough to make the thing hang together.
Yeah.
What you've got to really focus on is the people. Why do they do what they do? Why do they do it? What's the psychology? And for example, with the book that I'm writing at the moment, which is about Edward II and Isabella, there's a point where Edward is in a relationship with another man, and I'm reading about it in history books, and the thing that is coming across to me between the lines is that he was in a coercive control relationship. You know, something that we think in very modern terms
Mhm.
about. And I've actually made a couple of appointments next week to speak to some clinical psychologists to try and get under the skin of how that relationship might have worked, how it might have functioned.
Yeah.
And I think that's the level that you've got to get into, where the history is just the sort of warp and weft that is the furniture of the room that your people are going to inhabit, that your characters are going to inhabit. But really focus on the people and get to the point where you know them intimately, where you understand their motivations and you understand their character, and focus on that more than anything else.
Yeah.
If that helps at all.
I think it sounds beautiful. I think with historical fiction, you do, as a reader or as someone who's interested in writing it, I feel like you do tend to jump to what you know about the history and what you enjoy in the history, when actually a lot of it is so character based, and the stories that are enjoyable are to do with the characters and their motivations, because we don't have access to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gemma says Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. So
yes, I saw that pop up in the contest when you talk. Of course, it's Ferdinand and Isabella, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yeah, because Edward the first queen was Eleanor of Castile. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, she's fascinating. I went to Granada, where Ferdinand and Isabella are buried, and it's amazing. You go into the cathedral and you look into this. You go into this sort of basement crypt, and there are literally two lead coffins, bare lead coffins, side by side.
Wow.
In an empty room. It's Ferdinand and Isabella.
Yeah.
And you have those moments sometimes where you come face to face with something like that, and all the years just disappear. The only thing that's separating you from Ferdinand and Isabella, time. They're right there.
Yeah. A piece of lead and a plane of glass.
Yeah. Yeah. I found myself not so clever now, eh? Yeah, so I think she'd be fascinating to write about it. Yeah.
I am. What could you could you tell us a bit more about your experience with publication?
Yes.
How that came about.
Yeah. Well, having waited so long to write the bloody books, it all happened in the end in a bit of a rush.
Oh, great.
In a way, yeah. So, and I stopped working in 2017 and sat down to write. I thought it would be useful to have some sort of, I don't know, support to do it. So I did a creative writing MA at Warwick University. And it was, oh, did you do that?
I'm from Coventry.
Oh, of course you are. So, yeah, you're right on the doorstep then.
Yeah.
So, anyway, you could either do it in 1 year full time or 2 years part time. So I decided to do it part time over 2 years, and I thought, well, I'll give myself that 2 years to do the course and write the book. You know, and I thought that would be helpful, and it was terrific.
Yeah.
So I finished the course in 2019, finished the MA, and finished the book. Literally, the last assignment that I had to hand in for the MA was the final few chapters of Cecily.
Wow.
So that was September, so summer 2019. And I submitted the manuscript to agents in September. And then I signed with an agent just before Christmas, literally about 3 days before Christmas.
Wow.
We drank a lot of champagne that Christmas. And then she sent it out on submission to publishers pretty early in the new year, actually, about halfway through January.
Yeah.
And then we signed a deal with Penguin in March 2020.
Wow.
About a week before the whole COVID thing kicked off.
Wow.
The lockdown happened and all of that. So in a way that felt really lucky, because, you know, if you think back to what it was like at that time when COVID hit, everyone went a bit crazy and everyone was running around like chickens with their heads cut off, not quite knowing what to do about anything. And part of me sort of thinks, gosh, if we hadn't got that sorted out then, it might have all just frittered away and not come to anything. So I was really lucky, and there's 2 publishers interested in it, but it came down to Penguin in the end. And so that was 2020, and Cecily came out in 2021.
Amazing, incredible. And then was it just contracted for Cecily originally, or was it always the 2-book deal?
No, they knew there was a second book, and they were sort of, and they always talked about the second book as if it was happening, but they didn't actually contract, and I get that, let's take see what happens. So no, it was a 1-book deal, and then subsequently they contracted for the King's Mother and for Isabella. So
beautiful.
Yeah, really. I mean, honestly, do not pinch me, because I don't want to wake up. I'm having far too good a time.
Yes, I can imagine. I'm very excited for the next one. Do you have a title or a work in progress title?
Well, the work in progress title at the moment is just Isabella.
Yeah.
So I don't.
Following the theme though, I like it.
Yeah. Well, I remember with Cecily, it was funny because in my head it was always called Cecily. Oh, it's my Cecily book.
Yeah.
And then when I was at work, a couple of people said, "Oh, I don't know. Cecily's a bit of a funny name, isn't it? It sounds a bit Victorian. It doesn't sound very medieval. Maybe you need a different title." So I thought, oh no, maybe I need a different title. I came up with another title, which I thought was terribly clever. And then, so when it was submitted to publishers, it was under the different title. And then when I first met, the first meeting I had with Penguin, they were like, "We love the book. We love all this is marvelous, marvelous, marvelous. But it's one thing we want to talk to you about, which we think is a bit of a problem." Oh God, what's this going to be? And they said, "We don't like the title." I said, "Oh, okay." So they said, "We think you should just call it Cecily."
Oh wow!
We're like, "That's fine."
Yeah, don't worry about it. I'm fine with that.
They think it was going to be this huge problem, and I'm like, no, that's fine.
Oh, amazing! And the covers are gorgeous. The book covers are stunning.
I know. I'm so in love with the covers.
Yeah. Do you get much say in the covers at all?
Well, it was funny when we were doing Cecily. My editor said to me, she said, "So the cover," she said, "Do you have any ideas about what you want to see on the cover?" And I said, "Honestly, no." I said, "Because I don't have a very visual imagination. I do words. That's what I do. I don't do pictures. I just, I don't think that way."
Yeah.
I said, "I can tell you some things that I don't want." And she said, "Oh, okay, tell me that." So I said, "Well," I said, "I don't want it to look like traditional historical fiction,
I was going to say that. I was going to say it doesn't.
Yeah. I don't want damsels in distress and heaving bosoms and blokes in armour and women in pointy hats and gold swirly writing." And I said, "God's sake, no red and white roses, please." No.
Yeah.
I said, "I want it to look contemporary, and bold." She said, "Okay." And then literally the first thing she showed me was the cover of Cecily as is now on the hardback. Yeah. And I said, "Yes, it's perfect." Yeah.
I love that.
I think they did a great job with both.
They did. They're stunning. Both of them are stunning.
Yeah, I love them.
Which leads me into our giveaway. Our exciting giveaway. So to everybody who is here, Annie has very kindly said that she is willing to give away a signed copy of both Cecily and The King's Mother to a very special winner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take everyone's name. I'm going to put it in a little name wheel, and we'll spin it around that way. So I might just take a second for that. In the meantime, I may ask you another question, Annie, so that I can be filling it in. I would love to ask, what do you do when you're not writing?
I think about history. No. What do I do when I'm not writing? Well, I live on a small holding in Wales, near the Welsh border.
Yeah.
I didn't grow up on a small holding at all. But my partner did, and we met when we were both living in London. But I knew that she always really wanted to live on a small holding. So
yeah,
about 25 years ago, we moved out here. So when I'm not writing, I'm often looking after animals or putting up fences or moving hay bales or all that kind of thing. So I spend a lot of time doing that. And I'm a voracious reader. And these days, I don't read so much historical fiction. I read a lot of contemporary fiction and read very widely. I mean, that's the other advice about writing. You can't write a book if you don't read books.
No, of course.
That's where you learn to write, is through reading books. Yeah. Keep reading.
Whereabouts in London did you live?
East London, Leytonstone.
Oh, lovely. Lovely, lovely.
Yeah.
I was in London for 6 years until it got too expensive.
Well, it does. It does. Yeah, it does.
It's definitely not top 100 affordable places to live in the UK, for sure.
No.
Were there any... Oh, actually, I'll ask both of them. Were there any characters that surprised you while you were writing?
Surprised me. We've talked about Margaret and how I came to love her, I guess.
Yeah.
The other character that I always thought Elizabeth Woodville was just a bit annoying. And she was, genuinely, I think she was a bit annoying. But quite a fragile character. Anyways. And if you think of the four of them, Margaret, Elizabeth, and Cecily, the conclusion I came to is that Elizabeth is no less ambitious, no less maternally driven, and no less determined than the others. She's just not quite as clever.
Yeah.
As they are.
I love that.
Yeah. And I found that surprising, that realization that dawned on me through reading her is not that she isn't vicious and she isn't silly. She's just not as smart as they are. She's just not as worldly as they are. And she was, she was hideously betrayed by most members of Cecily's family, when you think about it, and particularly by her own husband, Edward IV.
Yeah.
And of course, having gone through all of those betrayals, of course, she's going to be suspicious of Richard. And of course, she's going to try and shoot first and ask questions later when he comes to the throne. So, yeah.
Amazing. I'm gonna spin the wheel now.
Woo.
Okay. I'm gonna do a little drum roll on the table. Or you might be able to hear it go. So the winner is Sophie.
Congratulations. So what will you do? Will you send me Sophie's? Oh, look, there's bells going all up the screen. Will you send me Sophie's address and things so I can post them to her?
Definitely. Sophie, if you could send an email to support@chapter25bookclub.com with your name and your post, your address, and I will get them sent over to Annie, who will be able to send them away for you. Congratulations.
Great. And Sophie, unless you tell me otherwise, I'll assume that you just want them dedicated to yourself, to Sophie. Yeah.
Yes, please. Perfect.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you.
And then I think finally, to round off, what were each of your favourite moments in the King's Mother and in Cecily?
Oh,
I know it must be so hard to pick.
Well, yeah, I'll tell you. There's a moment in The King's Mother where even now, having written the book about 20 times and read the damn thing about 1,000 times, that I still start to cry. I cannot read without weeping.
Yeah.
And that is the point where Richard's wife, Anne, dies.
Yeah.
And I start crying then, and I don't stop until I get to the end of the book.
Yeah.
So that is a kind of high point of The King's Mother for me. And the bit that I most enjoyed writing in Cecily, and perhaps this says horrible things about myself, but I had, you know, sometimes you just write a sentence and you say, oh yeah, that's it. You know, there's a point where Cecily and Richard have fallen out big time with Marguerite and Henry VI.
Mm-hmm.
And Cecily is desperately trying to build bridges, and she's writing a letter to Marguerite, really trying to butter Marguerite up, when actually she is full of venom towards her and just so angry with her. And Marguerite is pregnant at the time.
Mm.
And at the end of, she finishes the letter through, you know, dictated through gritted teeth.
Yeah.
And she allows herself a moment to imagine the time, to imagine the moment when Marguerite's baby would be born, and she would look at it and she would pick it up by the legs and smash its head against a wall. And she lives that moment in her head.
Yeah.
I remember writing that, and my tutor at Warwick read it, and she said, oh, Annie, she said, that's a bit much. I think I'd take that out if I were you. And I thought, no, I'm keeping it.
There's something to be said, isn't there, just about the things that you think when you're in. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine the situations that they were in, that with such high stakes and so much at play.
Yeah.
Give her that authority, give her that sense of ownership over her thoughts and stuff.
Yes, because you'd want to do that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, of course. And then you've got with Anne as well. I feel like Anne is such a fascinating woman that her story and everything is so interesting. And so sad.
Yeah, so sad. And I think she's often written off, you know, a lot of the books that you read, a lot of fiction that you read, certainly. She's sort of just a bit nothingy as a character, really. She's just a bit of a romantic heroine who Richard happens to fall in love with. But it's actually, I think at the beginning their relationship was one of two people thinking, we know what we want in life and we can give it to each other.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she needed a safe haven after the disaster of the marriage interference with Marguerite's son.
Yeah.
And he needed the security of her family to hold the door. And it was sort of, you know, they were both pragmatists.
Yeah.
Then they fell in love.
Yeah.
But
which is always lovely.
Which is always lovely. And I think she was just much smarter than most people give her credit.
Yeah, they do. I think she's so nuanced. She's often, like you said, just kind of a love-struck woman.
Yeah.
Alongside, a lot of her portrayals are very weak as well.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that's the case. I think she's very smart, very not secretive, but she knows what she's doing.
Yeah.
Cunning in a lovely way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cunning through kindness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Richard was looking for a girl like his mum.
Yeah. Like a Cecily in sheep's clothing.
Yeah. Yeah. I need someone I can really respect.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming, Annie.
It's been a complete pleasure.
Yeah, it's been so lovely to speak to you. I can't wait for the next book.
No, it'll be a while.
Don't mind, I'll keep it on my radar. I'll put a note in my calendar for 6 months' time and then a year's time.
Yeah. It'll be a while.
Well, I hope everything goes well, and I wish you every bit of success with that. And thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much. And just to anyone who's interested, you know, I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Blue Sky and all of those things. Follow me.
Yes, please do. Please do.
Yeah, and my website is anniegarthwaite.com.
Perfect. And if you haven't read them already, please go and read Cecily and the King's Mother. You really won't regret it.
Oh yeah, do read them and let me know what you think.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Annie. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your night, and I can't wait to see what's in store.
Thanks everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.